things that have been happening. Rivers turning red, blood red.
Hello, and welcome to the Son of Man Show. I have a special guest here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron.
All right, so we're going to talk about a few topics. One of them's the Shroud of Turin. Hello, welcome back to the Son of Man Show. I want to do today's episode because I feel like while there are those who abuse their power and law enforcement and their authority, there are also a very large percentage who are just doing their job. They're going out and prepared to face the ultimate risk. And welcome back to the Son of Man Show. If you guys are joining me, or if you're new to this, this is the second part of the series, Shared Faith. I chose to call it Shared Faith, not because we all share the same faith, but because we all share things in common for those of us who have faith or who are believers. If you're coming into this as a non-believer, this is a learning experience for you as well, so you can kind of figure out what it is that most world religions believe in. This is more so that people can engage with each other, even in religious conversations, without there having to be this this destructive kind of argumentative conversation taking place. Every time you start to drift into a topic that can lead to an argument and about your differences, instead you could steer the conversation into your similarities in order to peacemake and a more constructive conversation. There's just too much going on in the world today. There has been too much going on, especially in regards to faith or some kind of belief system that has led us to wars and fighting each other and blowing ourselves up. It's just nonsensical, really. If you will walk with me through this series of episodes, then I think you'll come to agreement with me that it's kind of nonsensical to fight and to bicker back and forth. There's too much we share to focus on what we don't. This is the second part of this episode. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the flood stories. So all of us who are Christian know, and most of us who aren't, know about the story of Noah. And this great deluge or flood that encompassed the entire globe. So it was a global event. Now, if it were, in truth, a global event or affected almost all the people around the globe, you would think you would find stories all around the globe. That's what we're going to take a look at here today as we go through this. I hope you guys stick with me. Okay, so what we have here is a global map, and it shows you a sample of the world flood myths at the very top here. And then you have the different colored markers, and these are to represent different cultures that have a flood story. And the green are the least like the Bible, but are still somewhat like it in the fact that there is at least a global flood reported in the stories. The blue arrows are somewhat like the Bible in the fact that they both have boats in the story that are constructed by the human who is either told by divine sources or is just led in on the fact that there is going to be this catastrophic deluge. And so he builds a boat, and this boat even happens to land on mountains at the end of the story in these two world religions, in these stories. And the Babylonians, of course, are the most like the Bible, as the Sumerians have almost direct parallel stories to a lot of Genesis and earlier Torah stories from the Gospel. I mean, some of them are almost directly pulled out of Sumerian text, and the Sumerians were actually a bit before the Bible was written itself. But the one thing all of these arrows have in common is they're spread out all across the world, and they all agree that there was a global flood. They all have a story about a global flood. Most of them, or some of them, have a savior in it that is essentially is the exact same character as Noah. He does have his family aboard the ark that he builds for survival, and in some stories it even lands on the mountain at the end of the story. So there you have a world map, and that gives you a quick overview of just some of the different cultures and the stories that are spread out and how vast and widespread they actually are across the world.
So here we have a chart that says Beyond Noah. I'll get you guys the link at the end. I'll try to get a link to all these different things that I used here, but this is a great little helpers tool. Again, I'm sorry the print is a little small, and it does seem like it's a little blurry. It's just a really, really small print, and I tried to find a way to enlarge it but couldn't. The chart says Beyond Noah, and it's the great flood myths from around the world. And of course, we see here, and I'm still using the chart because of this, it has the story from Greece, and in Greece, there's actually 2 or 3 different flood story myths. And then there's one from Finland. They also have their flood myth. And then you have India. And we're going to get into all this, guys, but I'm just kind of showing you where we're at around the world here. And then we have China, Australia, and Chile. So there's just a few more of the differences in cultures and the diversity of cultures that this flood story actually is a part of. So all these different belief systems and all these different cultures from around the world all share this flood story myth. Okay, so I'm going to open with the Epic of Gilgamesh, mostly because it's one of the most well-known stories among ancient flood myths or flood stories. I don't like to call them myths, but it just gets programmed in your head after you hear it so many times. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is from ancient Sumerians, and probably one of the first civilizations to actually arise in ancient Mesopotamia. But in their story, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it tells of a lot of heroic stories that Gilgamesh actually goes through. One of them being describing or depicting this great deluge or epic flood that was caused by a god, and a human being was warned of this flood that was going to come, and he was told to build this ark or this huge boat or craft, and he brings in all the animals. The only human beings that board the boat or the ark are his family, and it's pretty much depicted exactly the same as the story of Noah in the biblical account that is probably the other most well-known story. The only differences really being the deities that are worshipped in the stories by the characters. So that is really the only major difference between the stories. Other than that, the same historical event is being reported here, and that's kind of cool to me. So we already have 2, but it's not that surprising to me, I will say, because we're still in the East. I'm curious to get into as we get into the other stories around the world. Okay, so now we're into Greek mythology, and I thought this is a little bit further from the East anyway. In this story, we have a man and his wife, his family are basically chosen and forewarned by Prometheus, who is actually the father of the man in the story, that Zeus is going to send a flood upon mankind because they have been wicked and rebellious against the gods. And being forewarned, the man begins to construct an ark. He's building this ark for their salvation, and so him and his wife are saved. So I want to note a few things in the story, and I know that I kind of just summed it up, and I could have went through their names and then and recounted the entire thing. But the 3 main points here is that it is a divine cause and it is punishment. So Zeus sent this flood on purpose because of man's rebellion against the gods and for their wickedness. So divine cause, a forewarning to a chosen family that this punishment was going to come on mankind, and an ark that is constructed for salvation. So the main story, the main construct of the same story is still here and still very relevant and at play in the Greek. I will say there is a difference in the Greek because I don't know if I've said this already, but there are three major catastrophic floods that take place in the Greek story, and after all of these three floods and all the waters subside, what remains is the erosion of the continents and the land masses, which gives you the land masses that we have today and see today. It's said that they eroded the good grounds and those fell away with the waters. So that's just a little bit of the Greek, and I thought it was interesting that it was said to be a divine cause, and it was a punishment for man's rebellion and his wickedness and selfishness. And there's a chosen family who's said to worship correctly, and they are saved through an ark for salvation. I find that interesting, and it's pretty awesome and amazing. So I hope you guys are enjoying this, the fact that it is basically the same story. I know that it's kind of old here and it's the same thing over and over again, but in order for me to kind of explain that how it is similar, I have to kind of tell the stories. It is fun seeing where they have similarities rather than their differences. I will say that. Okay, so now we're getting into China's Great Flood story. And China's Great Flood story is centered around the Yellow River there in China, which is this huge river. And it says around 2000 BC or 1900 BC is when archaeologists think that this probably happened. But the Chinese have legends of a hero named Yu, and in this story he dredges out canals for the water and seeks to build a dam to try to stop and recourse the water to prevent this flood. What is interesting is archaeologists now have claims that it shares the characteristics of the Great Flood described in ancient texts, and also that an earthquake coupled with the dam that was built bursting and a landslide is probably what fueled this story. It was the largest flood in 10,000 years, said Daryl Granger, professor in the Department of Earth Atmospheric Planetary Studies. So he noted this as the largest flood in 10,000 years. It is said that this flood lasted an entire generation in the tales. It swept away many people, many homes, and established dwelling places. This professor of Purdue University says this flood was likely to have destroyed settlements for up to 2,000 kilometers downstream, or 1,240 miles. So imagine homes being swept away for 1,000 miles or more along this river. So it would have been devastating for these people. We can't be sure that these events are exactly what is being described in this tale, although it would seem that they are. But even the archaeologists agree that this would be on par with the same global flood epic that is told in stories such as Noah's Ark. Something really cool I wanted to share with you guys is this story is preserved in even their language itself. As you can see here with the diagram depicting their symbols for boat in their language. And it explains to you that the different symbols added together are vessel, 8, and people. So 8 people in the vessel, which could mean an ark, and all of that together means boat. So this is exactly the same as Noah's story in Genesis, where he was only able to save 8 people, which Jesus quotes again, I think, in the New Testament, saying Noah only saved 8. His family. So I thought that was pretty cool and interesting. I actually learned this ahead of time from Kong He. I'm sure I'm butchering that name, but you guys can find him. I'll leave a link in the description, and you guys will be able to click on that link, and it'll take you to a really cool video where he explains how he believes a God that is very similar, or very well could be the same God of Christianity, was originally the God that was worshipped, and that is preserved in their language even. It's just something really cool as he takes you through the language and the symbols and what they all mean. But that's something really cool to check out if you have the time. And like I said, I'll leave the link to that in the description. It's called God in Ancient China. Thanks, James Gowan, for the source material, the reminder there. I had previously watched the video of the guy, but the way he lays everything out is just really cool, and you can tell that he's on par with his studies. I liked that, and I came across this JPEG here, and I decided to share that with you guys because it is relevant to the story, and it shows you how deeply rooted these kinds of stories are in the minds of humanity. I believe that there is something to these stories, and that is why they are so deeply rooted in humanity. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself, there's certain aspects in that story, in his tales. I know I'm backtracking, but there are certain aspects in one of the tales in that story where he goes out and kills this lion, or it's depicted as different monsters, depending on how you read it, but it's most likely a lion. And it reminded me of the hunter-gatherers first becoming hunters, like sort of standing up for themselves, mankind first wielding weapons against wildlife and kind of taking a stand, like this is our land, and we're going to fight to defend it instead of being attacked by big lions and stuff, bears, whatever it be. But I think that those stories are so deeply rooted in humanity because it is in our subconscious, it is a part of our connected consciousness. I believe that that has something to do with why we want to preserve these stories and these tales. And I think that there's something even deeper than that to other aspects of it, where it just is purely spiritual. But there are some interesting stuff there. If you have the time and you're a reader, I would most certainly recommend picking up the Epic of Gilgamesh and reading that. It's worth a read. This guy also, this Kong He, is a really good guy to check out also, because you will find out a lot of information from him as well on how it's connected whenever you go back to the earliest sources of the religious culture. So I thought that was really cool. Here again, we do have this great flood. We have a warning by the hero of the story this time instead of a god, but by the hero himself, and he tries to find a way to prevent the flood from happening, or at least lessen the damage. And no ark this time, and no story of birds or anything like that. Just him channeling the river streams and protecting the people and saving as many as he could. But once again, if you go back to the language itself here, even boat is a vessel with 8 people in it. So I think that is just awesome. It's amazing. And it's one of those things, one of those kind of finds, deeper rooted in the cultures as we go along here, that I was kind of hoping to find. It's like a jewel among the resources we have here. I hope you guys are enjoying this, and we're going to be moving right along to the next one. Okay, so there is more than one Peruvian story of a great flood, as there's different little cultures there, different groups of people who have different but similar beliefs on this global flood, but they agree that there is a global flood. One has a myth of a deluge that is caused by a god whose presence was not recognized by the people. Only a woman survives and is instructed by this god to seek refuge on the highest mountain top. In the Inca pictorial records, it shows a flood as being higher than the tallest mountains. And as a quote, it says, "All created things perished except for a man and a woman, and they floated in a box. When the flood subsided, the box was driven by the wind, to uh, a, a high city or mountain that is about 200 miles from Cusco. Uh, some of you ancient aliens fans probably know more about this than I do, how to pronounce those. But yeah, so those two different myths right there. I find it interesting that the Inca themselves have this story. As you can see in the pictures, they're kind of in the mountains already, as far as where they're located. So pretty cool and pretty interesting that they also have this global flood story.